you're thinking about um, when you're thinking about kind of getting started on this pre-med journey, a lot of schools will have like a pre-health advisor. Generally, they're in like the life science department, just someone to kind of walk you through requirements, kind of gauge your interests, and kind of help you navigate this process, which can be, it's a long process in terms of like preparing for it and whatnot. Something to look out for within your school, and then these are some links for different types of advisors for the health professions that you all can access. And then these links, we generally have these um, links, and Spencer threw it in the chat so you can access them that way and save them that way. But this is a good place to start. So we are going to dive in first talking about letters of recommendation. So big picture is who you're going to ask. You're going to ask people who can not only like comment on various things that you want to highlight in your application, but people who have a little bit of weight behind them. So like doctors, PIs, professors, people who kind of have supervising roles, who comment on various aspects of your personality or different qualities that you wanted to highlight. Um, and then specific to DO schools, if you are applying to a DO program, you have to have one letter come from a DO physician. And so that's something that's unique to that process. Generally, when you're thinking about asking, the earlier the better. Um, I think that it's like you want to ask them early enough that they have time, but not so early that like they're going to forget or whatever. But even in that case, you can get the letter written early and then have them stored in a third party site like Interfolio, which is just a site that stores letters of rec, just because you yourself cannot access them as part of like the application process. And then give them the date that you would need the letter by. Generally, it's nice to have your whole application done by the time you send your primaries. You can still send your primary application without your letters of rec in, but when the schools actually do receive your application, they won't be able to process it and like actually start going through it until it's complete, which would include the letters of rec. So generally, just give them a date that's you know I tend to recommend like giving a date that's earlier than you actually need it, so that way, if they even if they are late, you kind of still have that time built in. And then how many you should get, 2 to 6. This will vary depending on the schools you're applying to. Each school requires, a lot of schools require a very similar kind of composition of letters, but some schools have unique requirements. So good to look into that. And then some things like committee letters, where a school will kind of put together a whole collection of letters, and that will count as one letter from your school. And then again, just make sure you're looking at the requirements. So, what should be in a letter of rec? So, this first link, guidelines for writing a letter, it's kind of just like a template or like a recommendations that the AAMC has. And so when I sent my letter writers a question, or asking them to write a letter, I sent my uh, my personal statement, at least what I had to that point, my like resume or CV, and then like anything that I thought would be helpful for them to write a strong letter. And in addition to that, I sent this guidelines for writing a letter, just so they kind of have like a template or kind of a rough idea of how they should go about writing this letter. For a lot of professors or doctors, they generally have written letters before, so it's not so much of a new process for them. But I was working at the time, and I asked my boss at the time to write a letter, and they were not in medicine or academia at all. And so having that resource to help them write this letter was also helpful. And then don't be afraid to like follow up with an email. These people that you're asking are generally really busy. And so, if it's been a while and you haven't heard anything, just, it's always okay to send them a reminder about the letter and just reinforce the due date. And then just asking them if there's anything else you could provide that would help the process. And then this is a template or an example of how you can go about asking someone to write a letter for you. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is just Um, Showing kind of again the CV, employment, volunteer experiences, anything that I think it's also generally helpful that when you're asking them to if there is something specifically that you know they could speak to highlight that. And so, if it's a professor who you did research with, like having them specifically comment on something related to your work ethic or your like recent publication, whatever it might be that that person can talk to, it's totally okay to like very directly talk about that and ask them that. And so, yeah, don't be afraid to kind of ask what you would want in these letters. And then here's another example of somebody who has not agreed to write a letter, but you are asking to write a letter. And so, you know, again, similar to the last example, try to keep these emails short. Um, they're very busy, and the longer the email, the less likely they are to go through it or respond to it. And so just try to keep it succinct and to the point, but still asking what you need. And I would say the biggest takeaway from this slide is when you're asking somebody to write a letter, very clearly state or like ask that the question should be if they can write a positive or strong letter of recommendation. And I think that's really important to include because there could be people who, can write a very generic letter of recommendation, but that is not overall adding to your application. If it's just a very generic, letter of recommendation. And so I think it's important to specify, like, can you write a positive or a strong letter? And people will be able to, people will kind of understand what you're saying and tell you yes or no. Personal experience, I had, I asked several of my professors to write a letter, and there was one professor who's just said, like, as a matter of kind of policy or principle, he like doesn't write letters of rec for students he has like less than two classes with. And so just because he felt like he couldn't write like a truly positive or strong letter. And so totally okay to ask that question. And I would encourage it. So these are the things that the AAMC puts out as like core competencies. And so these are things that they kind of expect and encourage medical schools to look for when going through medical school applicants. And so you can see that there's a wide range from professional to like critical thinking to science competencies. And as you can see, like the science competencies is like very few. And so a lot of what they look for is like these professional competencies, whether it's like service or teamwork, how you work with others, your humility. And so when you're getting people to write your letters, think about these competencies and think about how these specific people that you're asking could really speak to these specific points, because that's what's ultimately going to lead to a strong letter, and it's going to be something that the medical schools can see and really kind of uh, it's like the important stuff that they want to see in these applications. They don't want to see that you did like, it's important to do good in biology, but like a great doctor is not going to be somebody who's good in biology. It's going to be somebody who can like talk well and who's empathetic and who's reliable. So yeah, something to keep in mind when you're asking your letter writers. And so, specifically for the School of Medicine here at CU, they ask for 3 to 5 letters, and then if your school does require a committee letter or has a committee letter, they would want to see that. A lot of schools, don't have committee letters, and if that's the case, generally it's not something that'll like prevent you from applying to that school. They often will say like, we want a committee letter, and if not, then we would like 3 letter writers. So it's kind of like an either or situation. But if you have a committee at your school, generally they take those. And then yeah, if you send the maximum amount of letters, do they all get read? Yes. So again, be selective. Do you prefer 3 versus 5? There's no reach the minimum, but you don't feel like you have to max out. If you feel like the 3 letters that you would have would really be strong and all that you would need, then like, it's okay to send in 3 letters. And then again, a strong letter is somebody who knows you well, Specifically, the better letters are people who have worked with you for a long period. And then, um, kind of, we talked about this earlier, but just when you're getting a letter from somebody, it shouldn't be like a generic, like they were a great student and they got an A in my class. Like you should try to pick people who really can talk about specific experiences that highlight specific qualities that you're trying to show off. And so here is a letter of rec example. Again, we won't go through it all, but the stuff in purple is the stuff that kind of really is the showing and not telling. So like in the first paragraph, you see there's like a specific example that they reference. The second paragraph, another specific example. And so like you want to try to get letters from people who can talk specifically about experiences they had with you, and then their overall letter is not just, them telling a medical school that you're a great person, but really like showing the qualities that will be like sought out by a medical school. And so, yeah, these are kind of a example of a letter of rec, and we can move on. And so talking a little bit about uh, the difficulties in getting a letter of rec. And so some professors will have like stipulations of like, oh, they only will do one if you got an A, or they want to, like I said earlier, some professors will only do it if you had like more than one class with them. And then um, if if you have the idea and you already know you want to go into medical school and you've taken classes with a specific professor, you don't have to wait until, it come time to apply for medical school. It's often better to ask like right at the end of that course, just so they can like write down their experiences and it's a little bit more fresh. And so, they could write the letter at any point and then just like save it or again, submit it to one of those like letter writing companies. And so, um, earlier the better. And then we kind of talked about this earlier, but just staying in contact with the people who have agreed to write your letters. It's totally okay to check in. You're not bugging them. It's not like, it's not unprofessional. It's a part of this process and they understand that it's important. Um, Something that I think is really important is having a draft of your personal statement. Oftentimes, you're asking letter writers a lot earlier than you probably would have even started your personal statement, but it can just be like a very generic, rough draft. It doesn't have to be like a perfect polished copy, but just have something so they can see, the more information you can give them to kind of fill your letter with, the better it'll be. And then we already talked about this, making sure to ask for a strong letter. And then again, people are going to say no, or they won't even reply to your email. That's okay. That's why if you're trying to shoot for 3 to 5 letters, I would say ask, a couple more than actually you need, just so if people fall through or if people say no, you can at least make sure you're meeting that minimum requirement. And then this is some resources like we talked about to store your letters. So if you want to have your letter writer submit it, but you're like a year out from applying, Interfolio, which we mentioned earlier, AMCAS letter service. This is somewhere where you would upload the letters to directly to AMCAS, and then the bottom one is for DO schools specifically. And so yeah, so now we'll move into the school requirement section. And again, this can be a lot. So that should just be kind of like a cursory overview of it, not to get too in the weeds. So recognizing that every medical school has different requirements is important. A lot of times these requirements will be listed on their websites, or if you have access to the MSAR, which is like a search engine basically, through the AAMC that has all of the medical school like stats and requirements. This will also be posted. But generally, you can expect that you would need to take a year of biology, Gen Chem, OChem, physics, and then English, math, biochemistry, and statistics. I would say the last four is where you often come uh, or like expect some variability. Some medical schools only require like a semester of math. Some don't even ask for statistics, whereas some like strictly require it. And so again, it'll vary, but like it says on the bottom, the MSAR is a good place to kind of get all these resources. And then, this will vary depending on if you're in school or you're done with school. For me, I was done with school. And so there were some schools that when it came time to apply for medical school, I didn't have a certain class that I needed for that school specifically. And for me, that was just enough to not apply there. But I do know some people who like go back to community college or they will go take a class at that same university. Often they have like career advancement courses during the summer where you can go take like a version of OChem that would count for credit. So something to think of. You know, a lot easier to do if you're still in school because you can kind of work your schedule to meet these requirements. But if you're outside of school and you're done, again, there are some options. But yeah, these are kind of the big takeaways and the classes you can expect. Um, and something I will say on this is that the AAMC deals in semester units. And so personally, like I went to a school that was a quarter system school. And so you have to convert your units into semester units. And there was one point where that became like quarter units are slightly less than semester units. And there was a point where I actually was under the requirement because when it converted into semester units, I didn't meet the unit requirement. So something also to think about in case you go to a quarter school. Um, so these are some tips. Again, checking early so you don't take classes that you don't need to or don't want to. I think important to note is you don't have to be a science major. It's often a lot of people who go to med school are science majors because the classes for the major often overlap with the requirements for medical school. But there are plenty of people I know in our class who are like history majors, or they did like art history, or they did music. And so, uh, as long as you're meeting the requirements and taking those classes, you could major in whatever you want. Personally, I think majoring in something kind of not typical is a really easy way to kind of differentiate yourself and talk about something other than like, biology or medicine. And it's when you're reading applications, it's like the applications that are different or unique are the ones that stand out. And so this could be a good way to kind of stand out during the application process. Um, Something to consider too is AP credits. Some medical schools will take them as credits to meet the requirement, others will not. So just checking in with that. Um, and then again, for medical schools, nearly every medical school will require an MCAT. And so just making sure you've prepared for that and you've timed that appropriately with your application process. Um, and so the medical school will have, a specific requirement, and it's kind of up to you to um, like list that course and see if it meets the requirement for that school. And so there was a couple medical schools specifically where it asked for a certain requirement. I thought, I took whatever, anthropology, and then they had a requirement for something. I would just email the school directly and tell them like, hey, this is the course I took. Here's the course description for it. Would this meet this requirement? And oftentimes, a lot of these medical schools have like an admissions specific email. And so they would reply within a couple days and say, like, hey, this actually would not meet the requirement. Or like, yeah, this would meet it. Like, you're good. And so it's nice to have your syllabus or course description saved or just like accessible because sometimes they'll ask specifically to look at a syllabus just to make sure it's meeting the requirement. Um, and then again, when you're applying to a medical school, look at their specific requirements because generally a lot of medical school have similar requirements, but there can be like one or two classes that would be different. And if you don't have it, then it kind of takes you out from applying there. And so again, this is something specific to medical school here. So obviously they're looking for academic kind of proficiency in biology, chemistry, biochem, kind of what you would expect. And then students are often encouraged to kind of go above and kind of outside of that realm, just to kind of show interest and just overall show that you're a well-rounded student. And so, things like English and humanities courses, social sciences. So something to think about when you're an undergrad. And then this is the link for the school requirements, specific for Anschutz. And so again, most medical schools will have a page it'll list very plainly the requirements for that school. And then yeah, getting into creating a school list. And so there are over 100, I think it's like over 120 medical schools, specifically MD medical schools in the United States. And so a huge list, many different things to consider, whether it's geography, competitiveness, price, in state versus out of state. So a lot of factors that go into creating a school list, and it can kind of feel overwhelming, but hopefully we can kind of go over some of the big picture things. And so, kind of like I talked about this earlier, big things. Where can you see yourself being? Just in like simple terms of like geography, whether, if you know that like rain and cloudy skies are not your thing, then you're probably not going to be applying to the Pacific Northwest. And so, yeah, I think, and that's like not an understated thing. Like, I think it's really important to be honest with yourself of like where you could see yourself living for 4 years. And then like the more objective things like stats and GPA, MCAT, you've probably heard other people say it, and we said it in prior presentations, like your GPA and your MCAT aren't everything. They're one part of your application, but ultimately they still are a part of your application, and those will be things that are considered for schools. And so if you are applying to a school that is like really, really prestigious and really, really competitive, and your MCAT or GPA are like not in that realm, it is something to consider. Obviously, it's not saying don't apply there because there could be other parts of your application that kind of um, balance that out, but still something to consider. Again, prereq requirements. There were several schools that I didn't apply to just because I didn't want to take the prereq class, or go back and like take a summer class or something, and it turns out fine. The mission, like what the medical schools kind of stand for, things that they focus on in their curriculum or their engagement with the community, those things are important when you're trying to figure out if you're a good fit for a school. Curriculum. This is something that's like, I think, very rapidly changing and probably will continue to change. And so it's like with all the changes in medicine and medical education. So typically it was like 2 years of didactics and then 2 years of clinical setting. And some medical schools are transitioning to 1 year of didactic, so like lecture material, and then they get you in the clinic earlier and you have 3 years of clinic time and time in the hospital. So various programs are going to differ. This is not like a uniform structure for the curriculum, and so that's also something to consider. Personally, like for CU, we're at a 1 year didactic curriculum, and I really that was something that really was important to me because I wanted to be kind of in that hospital setting quicker. And then special programs, so combined degrees like an MD, PhD, public health, business, things to consider if specifically you want to do another program like that. Tuition cost obviously is a very important factor. Like I was saying earlier, in state versus out of state, those will definitely have differences in price. And then just overall, like certain medical schools are more expensive based off, if you're in like New York versus a more rural setting. And then something to kind of, keep in the back of your head, the out of state acceptance percentage. So like if you are an out of state student and this is information that would be on the MSAR, that search engine that I mentioned earlier, and they say like, oh, we actually only take like 5% of out of state applicants. Um, that's something to consider. Again, you could be part of that 5%, but that is just going to be a more competitive process. And these generally the the schools that kind of have these out-of-state acceptance differences tend to be public schools just because of like the way that state funding works and kind of quotas that they have to do in terms of accepting in-state applicants. Um, and so, something to consider. And then when you are applying to these schools, you're trying to sell to this school, like why somebody from out of state would be good for the school, and would be good for the state. It wouldn't hurt you to comment on like, oh, like I would really enjoy living in the state after residency or during residency. And so uh, all things to consider. And then when you're thinking of where you want to apply, like ranking could be a consideration. A lot of schools are kind of dropping out of the traditional like U.S. News and World and Report ranking, and so uh, you know, there's still like a tiered system. I personally think that it's not something you need to like really lean on heavily, but something to consider. Another objective metric. Um, this is just a table that's showing kind of the AMC provides like an example of how you could approach choosing a school. And so like on the left, you see various different types of factors that they would consider, or I guess that an applicant should consider, and then kind of going through that way and seeing if it's a good fit or not. So you heard me talk about this earlier throughout the presentation. So the MSAR is like the medical student. I don't know what the A and R stand for, but basically it's like a search engine specifically for medical schools. Every like accredited MD program in the US will have all of their information posted on here. And so it is really helpful when you're making your school list because like anything that you can think of in terms of like relevant data will usually be on here. And so like the enrollment data, specific deadlines for that school, any requirement that they need for letters of rec or courses. It gives you breakdown of like GPAs, MCATs, ethnicity, sex, experiences. Like each school will tell you like, oh, like 92% of our applicants did research, like 10% of our applicants are in the military. So like like a lot of relevant information that kind of would be important when you're making your school list can be found on here. And then these are the prices. So, it's not as expensive as some of the other resources involved in medical school application, but it is something to consider. And then if you are able to and you do qualify for the fee assistance program, you will actually get this included as part of that. And so something to consider applying to beforehand, just because if you buy it yourself and then get approved for the fee assistance, they don't like retroactively, refund you or anything like that. So if you can kind of think ahead and know that you are going to apply for this program, could save you a couple bucks. And so this is an example of what the MSAR looks like. Oh, medical school admission requirements. So yeah, it's a search engine kind of thing. And then you see on the left, you can like filter out by different uh different filters, whether it's location. And then there's more to this page, like you can do GPA. And then on the top, you can just search institutions. And so if you click, once you're subscribed and you click a certain medical school, it'll pop up with like way more information. But each of them usually give like a header and the general information of like the size, application deadlines, tuition, things like that will be on here. But a very, very, very helpful resource when making your school list. I would say this is one of the more important things that I got when I was applying to medical school, and it's very helpful. This is another resource that you can use. It's the Lizzie M score. And so this is like kind of like a calculator, I guess, where you input your like basic stats and then it'll basically crunch a number out and tell you, your chance of getting admission to at least one medical school based off the data that you'd put in. And it takes your GPA, your MCAT. These are nice because it kind of is like, it's one more thing that can kind of reassure you. But as you can kind of see on the left and you know, these aren't an entire application. Like you can't put your personal statement in here. You're not putting your experiences. Um, and so these are nice, but they're not like everything. And this is not like a 100% accurate um, reflection of like your actual percentages. And so don't let this be too discouraging. It's just one more, resource for you. Um, so approaching out-of-state friendly schools, like we talked about earlier, the MSAR is helpful because you can see um, it'll break it down specifically in like the application numbers. It'll tell you like how many people apply from out of state. Out of those people, how many people get an interview, and then out of those people, how many of those people get accepted. And so it can be helpful because you can see like if a school, gets 10,000 interviews from out of state, but then they only offer 50 interview or 10,000 applications from out of state and they only offer 50 interviews, then like that might not be a very like out of state friendly school. Again, it's not something to deter you, but more just keep in mind. And you don't want to make a school list that has, a lot of schools that are not out of state friendly because then you're obviously lowering your chances. And um, ultimately applying to medical school is a bit of a numbers game. And so you want to do everything you can to optimize your chances. And then something to kind of, just increase your odds is thinking about any connections you have to a state. So like if you used to live there, if you have family there, just any type of connection you can make. And then if you are currently in state, like for tuition reasons and whatnot, you often have to provide like proof of residency. So it's like bills or like registration for your car, things like that. So something to kind of keep in mind. And so, big question of like how many schools an applicant should apply to. So obviously this will vary depending on your competitiveness and just other factors, but the average number is 15. And so for bullet point, if you're like, for simplicity's sake, if you're applying to 10 schools, apply to two reach schools, one to two should be safety schools, and then the rest should be like close to your level. And so this kind of goes back to looking at the MSAR, looking at objective data, how you kind of match up compared to the average people who are applying to that school. And so, yeah, don't be afraid to apply to a reach school. Like, if Harvard is your reach school, then like apply there and really put serious effort into that application because, you know, it might happen. But your entire list shouldn't be reach schools because again, you would be decreasing your chances of getting in. And then again, your how you would define a reach goal is if you are below the average for kind of these objective stats. If you're not the type of student they would necessarily take, being like an out-of-state student. Um, and then something to consider is that medical school applications are very expensive. And so if you don't qualify for the fee assistance program, the total application process can easily get like into the thousands, just because generally every school that you apply to, um, is 50 to 100 bucks. And that's like, whether it's like the primary or secondary, you can kind of expect to pay, multiple fees to different schools. And if you're applying to 20, 30 schools, that'll definitely quickly add up. Um, and then another thing too is like, if it's feasible and you can do it and nothing else is restricting you and like you want to apply to 40 schools, like you also have to consider that for all those schools that you're applying to, you're going to get a secondary back. And generally secondaries, which are like questions that the med school will specifically ask you, they're generally like at least 1 to 5 different prompts. Some of the short little blurbs, some of them could be longer blurbs. And so you also have to think of like the time that will go into completing those. And especially if you are working or you have other life commitments. Um, and then the bottom point is like a simple point, but don't apply to a school that you never consider going to. And so like, you know, if it's like a hard negotiable, like non-negotiable for you, where like you do not want to be in Arizona because it's too hot, like don't apply to a school in Arizona because that's taking up time and energy. It's more cost for you. And then if even if you got in, and if you didn't want to go, then you're kind of still in the same position. And so these are just some more general tips. Certain schools, specifically like the Pacific Northwest, has like you might have heard it, it's like the whammy. So it's like Washington, Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, and Idaho. So these schools will kind of there's not very many medical schools in these states. And so like specifically like the University of Washington, they preferentially kind of pick applicants from these states for that reason. And so we talked about it earlier, get in touch with the pre-med advisor. I would also say that like don't let a pre-med advisor kind of like steamroll you. There are many people that you can talk to in medicine and medical school who tell you like that their pre-med advisor told them they weren't a competitive applicant or they told them that they should wait and apply next year. And so like, it's very helpful to talk to somebody who has more insight. But I don't think you should let it be like the one thing that determines whether or not you apply to medical school. I think you should be honest with yourself, kind of where you're at in your life, your competitiveness, and take everything that they say with like, in the context of who you are as a person and your application. Um, and yeah, starting like we talked about earlier, starting your this can kind of be daunting, but I found that like the easier ways to start were like statistics, location. Um, for me, it was location. Like I knew that I didn't want to go to certain states. And so right off the bat, that took off like probably half the medical schools I was going to apply to. And so it's a good way to kind of filter through these schools. Um, Once you start getting secondaries and things like that, it's going to get very overwhelming with like knowing when you got secondaries and which ones you finish and which ones you haven't, and which ones are similar that you could reuse. And so making an Excel sheet with like all of this information is a really, really good way to like be efficient and not get too bogged down and just like logistic stuff and free up time for you to actually like write and finish your application. um Reddit and like things like Student Doctor Network and things like websites like that, those also can be a a resource. As with all of those, like these are opinions, these are um ultimately like unvetted uh blog posts. And so it's a great way to kind of get more information, but you know don't have it be like the ultimate thing that makes your decision for you. It's just one more data point, but ultimately you should consider everything. And yeah, but definitely a good resource to have. Um, all right. And then this is the
Jacob,
post
can I add
session.
something here?
Of course, Brendan.
Hi guys, I'm Brendan. Sorry, I was in class till late, so I'm just joining. But I'm a third year med student as well. Um, I think all of these resources that we're sharing with you guys are really, really amazing. Uh, but one thing that I wasn't told until a little bit later in my process is, yeah, you can look at all the stats. The MSAR is really great to start building your list. But some of the more important things that can factor in what schools you want to apply to and what schools you're more competitive at are some of the values and the missions of the school. So, for example, I applied to one school where I really felt that I met the statistics and I like felt good about my chance of getting in there. But after getting back the secondary from them, which I should have known this earlier if I did a little bit more research, their school was really focused on like health policy and government. And that is just not my cup of tea. And so I did not really have a lot to say in that secondary. So, on top of all the stats, I think you can also look at the kind of ethos and the mission of a school. And that is something that's really important and can set you apart. For CU, I don't think I necessarily had the stats. I was probably on the lower end compared to some of my classmates, but I think I really felt at home with the mission and the values of CU. And I think that that's really what set me apart when I was applying there.